decided to call this morning's talk Babble. In fact, Babel is where we get that word Babel from. And so far as we've been looking through Genesis, we've been looking at a lot of places where it talks about Jesus. This morning is slightly different because one of the features of this story is that it has some elements that become prophetic about things that happen later, and you'll see how that works. But one of the things that we've touched on as we've been looking at Genesis is that often you get something that happens in one direction and then you have a reverse, something that happens in the opposite direction. And this happens in this story. There is what is called chiastic prose or chiastic poetry. And very often you'll find in the Bible that passages are structured in a way that they seem to go forwards in one direction in their theme and then go backwards. And so what you'll notice is that in verse 1 and verse 9, we have the introduction and the conclusion. And the normal notation for indicating these chiastic things is where we put a dash at the top of the letter. So you've got A, we have the introduction, A dash, the conclusion. And then we move in a level. We have a description in verse 2 about the travels of mankind. And then we have in B dash, we have mankind is scattered. So in both of those lines, you have a movement of mankind. Then we have in C, the human plans are described to build a tower. In C dash, we have the divine plans to stop the building of the tower, the reversing of that. And then you have the central verse in the middle of the pattern, which is where God has come and inspected what's going on. He's come to have a look. And so we see this moving in one direction and then moving back again. And this happens a lot throughout the whole Bible, this form of prose or writing. Some people kind of just dismiss some of these things as just being simply poetry. But just because a thing is poetry, it doesn't make it not true. It doesn't make it not real. And this morning I'm going to talk a bit about language, because language is very interesting. Language is one of those things that's always fascinated me. And there is a quote by a man called Jeffrey Williams, who once said you can never really understand one language until you understand at least two. When I was at school, in my final year, I met a teacher who had just joined the school. And he was an amazing man. He had this huge amount of knowledge. Very, very clever individual. And he was a genius as a teacher. Absolute genius. And he could walk into a room of unruly children, and within moments, he would have them all working hard, almost competing with each other to show how hard they would work for him. And yet he was gentle. There was nothing authoritarian about him. He just had this amazing way of handling children. And over the years, he had collected a number of friends who were also brilliant teachers. And although I had never taught in state schools, he recognised in me something of a teacher. And so he used to invite, every year, he used to gather these guys together, and we would actually share stories, we would tell anecdotes, jokes, so forth. We would eat together, and they were usually wonderful weekends, which were very stimulating. And all of these guys were very clever teachers. And I was sitting one day talking to one particular teacher, and he was telling me this story about how towards the end of an academic year, he was told that next year he was going to take this particular group of children for English. They were children who this was going to be their last year. They had no interest in doing formal examinations, and he just knew He knew the characters who were going to be involved there and knew that this was going to be a very difficult class, very unruly children. And he thought, what am I going to do? So he spent the summer break thinking, what can I do? How can I teach these kids English for this last year? They're not interested. They just want to get out of school. They just want to leave. They just want to move on. And then he came up with an idea. On the first day, he deliberately arrived into the classroom late. They were all mucking about. There was ructions going on in the classroom. And then he appeared. He came in through the door and paused and looked up and down the corridor. He closed the door and locked it. He pulled the blind down over the window. And all the kids, what's going on? He then walked over to the window and looked out of the window to see who was watching. And then he came and he sat on his desk. And they're all waiting. This is very odd behaviour. And he said, you don't want to be here, do you? I thought, yeah, right. He said, you know what? When I was told that I was going to take this class, I didn't want to be here either. And immediately there's a kind of an affinity between him and the student. He said, I know that you're supposed to be learning English this year, he said, but I've got an idea. How would you like to learn a secret language that nobody else knows? We'll do this, but you must promise me one thing. You will never tell anybody what we're doing in this classroom. So, he said, you must promise, before we do this, not to tell anybody. So they said, well, can we tell our parents? Absolutely not. Can we tell the teachers? Definitely not. What about our friends? Nobody. You discuss this with nobody. How will this be a secret language if you discuss it with other people? Okay, so how are we going to do this? Right, he said. What we're going to do this year is we're going to learn Zulu. Gosh, sir, I didn't know you could speak Zulu. I can't. I'm going to learn Zulu with you. And so they learnt this language, which they knew that nobody else in the school was going to know this language. It was becoming a secret language. They could talk to each other in front of the others and nobody else would know what they're talking about. And the more the year went on, the more excited they got about this idea of learning something, learning a secret language that nobody else knew. And they really got into it. And in the last few days at the end of the year, he said, oh, by the way, he said, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I've been told that you have to do a test. You have to do an English test. He knew this was coming. He knew this was coming at the beginning of the year. So all the kids go, oh. He said, look, don't worry about it. You're not here next year anyway, are you? Oh, yeah. So he said, so just do it as a favour to me. Just do the best you can with it, but don't worry about it. We've had fun this year, haven't we? Yes, great. So they took the test. They all got 100%. You see, in order to learn Zulu, they had to know what a verb was. They had to know what an adjective is. They had to know what a noun is. They had to understand the fundamental structure of language, but had to understand that in English in order to be able to understand what was happening in the Zulu. Without them realising it, he spent the year teaching them English. But they did it through learning Zulu. And to this day, he can be at some part of the world and suddenly hear a Zulu greeting, and look around and see one of his ex-students greeting him in Zulu. If we listened to scientists talking about language around the world, people around the world, we would have had this understanding that people were separated over millions of years. The slow separation of the continents over millions of years took place, that peoples were separated into separate groups. And if that had taken place over millions of years, then language would have evolved over millions of years to the point where we would find it very, very difficult to even begin the first steps of understanding what somebody else is saying. And I just want to look at that for a moment. The very fact that it is possible for us to meet a completely different people and yet within a relatively short time be able to understand and communicate with them is because there are fundamentals in language that are common to everybody on this planet. You know, there are almost 7,000 languages spoken worldwide. And there are 150 different language groups. And one of the things I love science fiction stories and science fiction shows. Because science fiction stories are able to encapsulate things that we can't encapsulate sometimes in real life. How do we communicate if the entire structure of language is different? In one particular show, a linguist is faced with this from an alien. It's a language. Where do you even start? What does this mean? And in the movie, the military are getting frustrated because they want her to progress quickly in being able to understand this completely alien species. And she says, well, fundamentally what you want to know is what is the purpose? The question you really want me to ask these people who have arrived here on Earth, you want me to ask the question, what is your purpose here? She said, you have to understand that before we can even ask that question, we have to understand certain things about our relationship here. Is a question like this a metaphysical one or is it a physical one? You know, I could say to you, what's your purpose here? And you would understand that to mean literally that you're in this room here, that you've come here for a purpose, and I would say probably the purpose that you're all here for is to come here and spend some time in the presence of God to learn something about it. Or is it a much wider metaphysical one? Is it, what is my purpose? Why did God put me on this earth? What is my reason for existing? Is it metaphysical or physical? How is the concept of a question handled? You know, we take it for granted that we ask something in a certain way and it's understood to be a question, but what if a totally alien species doesn't even have a concept of a question? Let's talk about an alien species right here on Earth, a cat. Anybody notice something fundamentally different between a cat and a dog? A cat really is not curious. I mean, they talk about curiosity of a cat, but actually, you put something down in front of it, and it walks off. A dog, you put something down in front of it, sort of, what's that? It's very curious about it. But a cat's not even curious. If you could speak the language of a cat, would it actually even understand a question? What is your purpose here? You're asking these aliens, what is your purpose here? Are we asking, what is the purpose of their species in coming to this planet? Is it your collective? Is it a collective question? Or is it individual? Do we want to know why Joe Alien has decided to sign up, to join this exposition, to come here? What is his purpose? Who are we talking about when we say your? What is a purpose? Do they even have a purpose? Do they function by instinct? Or do they function by planning, thinking through and design? Do they operate like a hive? You know, a bee, it has a job to do, but it doesn't think anywhere beyond that. What is the timescale? Does is mean now? Does is mean last week? What does is mean? Where? Are we talking about the universe, the planet, the actual place where the person has put his foot? There are so many questions that we need to answer before we can even ask that question in a meaningful way. Language structure is very similar across this planet. Very similar. Why is it that we don't say, the boy dog this is Frisbee playing with? Does that even make sense? It needs to have some kind of a structure that we can follow, that we can recognise. The boy is playing Frisbee with his dog. We understand that. There is a structure, there is a link here. Now I'm about to put a paragraph up on the screen. And what I would like somebody to do, let's nominate somebody. Joshua, would you like to stand up and look at the screen? Now, when I put this up, I'm going to say go as I put it up. And what I want you to do is, without thinking about it, I do not want you pausing and looking at individual words. What I want you to do is to read the sentence as though you're reading a sentence reasonably quickly that you're reading out of a book. I want you to read this sentence, but I don't want you to stop and start looking at the words, okay?
Okay, sure.
You ready?
Yeah.
Go.
According to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters are in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and the last letter is at the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind doesn't read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole.
No, we understood the instruction.
Yeah. Now look closely at the words. The order of the letters are completely scrambled, and yet he read that at a normal pace without any problem. In fact, it's called fake news because this went out as an email. Nobody actually knows who sent it. Research was not done at Cambridge University until this email went out. And it was sent to linguistics departments around the world, and they were so fascinated by it that it was added into their curriculums. But it works, as you can see. What we find is that all languages on Earth fundamentally rely on having a subject, a verb, and an object in each sentence. And there are just 6 combinations of order in which those 3 can happen. So the first 2, where the subject is first, they account for 87% of all languages around the world. He loves her, or he, her loves, is the order. So English and French, typically he loves her. German and Japanese, he, her loves. Then there is a much smaller percentage that begin with the verb first. And as you can see there, we're looking at about 12%, including Arabic, Hebrew, Malagasy, Proto-Austronesian. So you have loves he, her, or loves her, he. We've now got to 99% of all the languages on the planet. Sentences that begin with the object, only 1% of the languages on the earth begin object, verb, subject. And actually, it says no percent, but there is one tribe on the planet that uses the object, subject, verb order, which is a tribe called the Wario tribe. There are no other known tribes or peoples on the earth that use that order. But interestingly enough, again in science fiction, the Klingon language invented for the Star Trek series uses that order, and Yoda from Star Trek uses that order. He loves. There are some interesting reversals as well. In Chinese, they have a problem because they don't have the letter R in Chinese. And so they struggle with the letter R, and so consequently you will hear them say fly dice, because the R gets switched to an L. But interestingly enough, in Japanese it's the other way around. The Japanese have no L and convert it to an R. It's completely the opposite. And in Japanese, you can only end a word with one consonant. All words have to end in a vowel, but there is only one consonant that is allowed to end a Japanese word. So in their counting, ichi, ni, san, shi, go, roku, and so forth. And before the Americans went to Japan, they actually didn't have a word for lunch or milk. And of course, the Americans love ham sandwiches, hamburgers, that kind of thing. So these are Japanese words which have been taken from American English. So you can go into any restaurant in Japan and ask for a hamo sandwichi, and they know that they have to give you a ham sandwich. Or you can go and ask for a hamburger. With that, you could have a green salada, green salad. You could have this for lunch, ranchy. You could have a drink with it, milku, a glass of milk. So these are now Japanese words that everybody in Japan understands. But as you can see, none of these end with a consonant. They all end with this vowel sound. Then there's a thing called dependency length minimalization, which is important in language structure. Certain words that are linked to other words in a sentence, no matter how long it is, there is always an attempt in the structure of the language to shorten the distance between certain key words, because otherwise the sentence can start and you don't know how it's linking together, because if the gap becomes too big, it starts making it difficult to understand. You know, I saw a documentary some years ago which I found amazing. I mean, one of the things we've touched on a little bit through this series, we saw how Satan had entered the serpent, and how the serpent was obviously compliant with Satan and therefore was punished. That there is an indication that animals also are required by God to follow certain rules, and that when they don't, they get punished. The whole of the flood comes about. Notice that it's not just mankind that is punished, but it's also animal kind. God says all flesh has become corrupt. Animals have become compliant. And one of the things that scientists are beginning to realise is that animals are far more intelligent than had been realised. That animals actually, some of them do have complicated language systems. Dolphins, scientists know they have a complicated language, but we still have not broken an understanding of that. And there was a documentary, as I say, that completely amazed me, where a chimpanzee had been brought up from a baby, and it was taught how to do sign language. And the moment in the documentary that just kind of blew me away, really, the chimpanzee was sitting on the shoulder of a researcher, and he had his arms across her head, and he was just kind of looking around, and he was just being patient and quiet, and you had no sense that it was engaging at all. And the researcher was telling the story of how this chimpanzee had come to learn sign language. And so she is speaking, telling the story. And all of a sudden, there was a moment there where the chimpanzee suddenly turned and just tapped her gently on the head. And she turned and she said, "What is it?" And the chimpanzee leant forward and began doing sign language in front of her face so that she could see it. And she watched for a moment, and the chimpanzee finished, and she said, "Oh yes, I'd forgotten to tell you something very important in this story." The chimpanzee had been listening to her and had recognised that in order to tell this story properly and meaningfully, there was an element of the story that she'd forgotten to say, and the chimpanzee had told her what element it was that she needed to say. There's an intelligence there, an understanding of language there, but a chimpanzee can't speak it because it doesn't have the right vocal cords in order to be able to speak our language. Another piece of science fiction. An amazing episode of Star Trek where, at the beginning, the captain of the Enterprise meets an alien vessel and tries to communicate with the captain of the other vessel. And something is going wrong. In the series, they have what they call a universal translator, that it's supposed to be able to translate anything. But the universal translator seemed to be struggling here, because it seemed to be using proper nouns for people and place names, and then there were other words in there. And so the captain would say something like Darmok and Jalad on the ocean. What does that mean? The beast at Tanagra, Temba, his arms open. And this captain keeps using these phrases, but the crew of the Enterprise, they have no idea what this is all supposed to mean. There's frustration on the bridges of both ships. And eventually, one of the other crew says something which is obviously derogatory about the Enterprise crew. And the alien captain goes, "Luca, in winter." What does it all mean? And what is very clever about this program is right at the end, there is another scene where the captain is talking to the guys on the bridge, and he's learnt this language. And so he has a whole conversation with them. Now, if you don't watch the bit in the middle, both conversations are meaningless. But if you watch the episode, what happens is you learn the language. It teaches you the language. This is a culture that no longer uses the normal sentence structure that we use, but has developed a situation of concepts. It's a bit like if I said Hamlet with the skull of Yorick. That becomes a symbol for a person who has discovered treachery at home and is grieving for the death of his friend. And so this is what has happened in this culture. Their whole language has been reduced to these references to either literature or real events. And so what we learn through the program is that Darmok and Jalad on the ocean means working together against a threat to succeed. The beast at Tanagra, a problem that needs to be solved. Temba, his arms open, take this gift and use it. Shaka, when the walls fell down, means failure. Mirab, with sails unfurled, means begin the journey. We learn these through the episode so that we end up by understanding the conversation, but a language that completely breaks all of our rules. So what happens, do you think, if we have a language 4,500 years old that came into being just after the Tower of Babel? Imagine a people who are taken, given a new language, removed to a far part of this planet. They can understand each other, but it's a new language. Imagine a people who have devised or felt the need to quickly devise a new writing system. What can they use as a basis for their writing system? Imagine for a moment that people think, well, the only thing we really know about is the story of how everything that happened up to this moment. The story of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Cain and Abel, the story of Noah, the story of the Tower of Babel. That's what we know. And imagine then that they use all of those concepts in order to design a new language. A language which has coded into it the whole of the story of Genesis from creation through to the Tower of Babel. Wouldn't that be amazing? Guess what? There is such a language. It's Chinese. Recent discoveries in studying the language have realised that the whole of the Chinese character system is all based on the stories of creation through to the Tower of Babel. There's 2 good books on it. There's a couple of websites on it. This is a rapidly growing area of study. So much so that Christians in China now, when they're going out evangelizing, and they begin to evangelize and people say, no, wait a minute, Christianity is too far removed from the Chinese philosophy and beliefs. And the Christian evangelists now say, really? Let me show you something. Let me show you something. Because originally, the Chinese only worshipped one God. This is recorded in the Shuqing Book of History by Confucius. In 2230 BC, a sacrifice was made to Huang Tian Shangdi, the only god they worshipped at the time. And during that sacrifice, the first emperor, Shun, said this: "Of old, in the beginning, there was the great chaos without form and dark. You, O spiritual sovereign, came forth in your presidency. You made heaven, you made earth, you made man." This predates Moses by 1,000 years. So who is Huang Tian Shangdi? Well, Huang Tian means emperor of heaven, and Shangdi means highest deity. Hang on a minute, Shangdi sounds slightly familiar. The Hebrew word Shaddai means Almighty God, all-powerful God. Shangdi means the highest deity, the most powerful deity. They virtually mean the same thing. In fact, D can be used on its own. Isn't it interesting that as you travel around the world, how many words have this D sound? Deus, Dio, Dios, Dio, Diet. Even the Greek is very close with Theos. In fact, sometimes some Greeks pronounce it sounding a little bit more like the D. Dios, Zeus. So let's have a look at some of these Chinese characters to see how this message is appearing. By the way, the interesting thing is that I happen to be sharing an office with a lady who is Chinese. And when I came across this, I went in and I said, my first sentence was, have you heard of this idea that the first couple of books of Genesis are encoded into the Chinese language? And her reaction was immediately, oh yes. And she then started to tell me how the Christians do it. She said, in fact, the Chinese used to worship just one God. And I said, Shangdi. She said, yeah. She knew all about it. So here's one of these characters. It's a character for garden. Think about Eden for a moment. An enclosed area. And we have the source of 4 rivers, we're told about in the Bible. So if you imagine the centre as being the source, out from that centre we have like this cross of 4 rivers coming out from the centre, out from the source. And so what we're just going to look at is we're going to look at some Chinese characters and what the word means, but look at how the character has been built up. So let's take the Chinese word, for example, for prohibition, something that is forbidden. What do we see? What we see is trees, Chinese character for trees, and the Chinese character for a divine command. Put them together, prohibition, something that is forbidden. Let's take a look at the word for the devil or Satan. It's made up of 4 characters: a secret, life, a person. No, it wasn't just that the serpent was just an animal there. There is a person. There's the person of Satan involved. It took place in the garden. And so you have the character that puts all of those together into one character that has those Chinese characters assembled in it. The idea of Satan coming along with this. Let me tell you a secret. If you eat that, you'll become like God. Life. He questions whether they will really die if they eat this fruit. He is a real person. It's taking place in the garden. Perhaps the idea of fruit is not surprising, but we have garden, we have tree, assembled together we have the word for fruit. What about desire or greed? Here's an interesting one. Desire or greed uses 2 characters, a woman and 2 trees, for desire or greed. The word for naked, clothing, tree, and garden. Put them together, we have naked. The concept of I, we, or us. You'll see where this is going in a moment, but that concept of I, we, or us, a hand and a lance, something for cutting. But if you now take that combined I, we, or us, and join it with a sheep, a sacrifice of a sheep, we get the Chinese word for righteousness. So we have this word made up of 3 other Chinese words: sheep, hand, and lance, for a sacrifice. The word for a curse in Chinese. If you remember, Cain was cursed. So the word curse is made up from eldest brother, because Cain is the oldest brother, and the symbol for a mouth. And so we have this character, a double-mouthed character. Double-minded, double-mouthed, unstable. But here's a really interesting one. The Chinese character for somebody who is cruel, untrustworthy, a killer, cruel, untrustworthy, or a killer, is a sign that uses the eldest brother, but where you would imagine the head to be, there is a cross. The mark of Cain, a mark on the forehead, as it were, a curse. How about the ark? God commanded Noah to build an ark to save 8 people. So the Chinese character for a big boat is 8, a mouth or command, and the symbol for a normal-sized boat. All those put together, a big boat. And then we come to the Tower of Babel itself. As you heard in the passage, they chose not to build this out of stone, but to build it out of clay, baked clay. First two characters here are grass and clay you normally mix together in the ancient world and then bake it to form bricks. The symbol for mankind, the symbol for one, the symbol for a mouth. What are we saying? Mankind with one mouth, one voice, one language. All put together creates this symbol for a tower. I mean, these are just a few examples that I've pulled out. But the Chinese, when it's pointed out to them, can see it and agree that there is no doubt. When they start looking at them and look at the... Obviously, there are 50,000 Chinese characters. And all of their words, the meaning comes from events that happened leading up to the Tower of Babel. Now, what I said at the beginning is that, and I've mentioned in a couple of previous sessions, is that we see these patterns that kind of move forwards and then reverse. And we have one of these patterns that is starting here in Babel. Babel is an event where God intervened and multiple languages were spoken so that nobody could understand. Years later, there's an event at Sinai, an event where 70 elders of Israel hear God's voice and understand Him. And then we go to Pentecost, where we get the full reversal. An event where God intervenes and multiple languages were spoken so everybody could understand. This forwards and backwards thing. You know, at the event in Sinai, Jewish tradition holds that the 70 elders represented the 70 known nations at that time, Gentile nations. In fact, if we were to do a careful and longer study, what we find is that there are references to the fact it wasn't just Israel who came out of Egypt, but there were actually representatives of other Gentile nations that came out with them. We actually see this in Scripture. And so it's possible that these 70 elders, and Jewish tradition, as I say, says that these 70 elders were made up of representatives from these other Gentile nations. And they hold that only Israel responded, which is actually not quite true. Because, again, if you look through Scripture, you'll see how other nations do respond, even though Israel doesn't. But we get a reversal, a bigger reversal between Sinai and Pentecost. At Sinai, we have certain signs. There's fire, there's wind, there's thunder. Just as at Pentecost, there's tongues of fire and wind. All present understand. And it's interesting that after the event up on Sinai, Moses comes down and finds that the people have entered into idolatry, and it says that 3,000 died. But after the event at Pentecost, after God caused a restoration, an understanding of language, 3,000 people were saved. A full reversal. There is something fascinating about this whole aspect of language. If God had really wanted us not to understand each other, He would have given us language systems that were so different. There would be no way we could understand. We would have as much difficulty understanding another human being in a different language as we have understanding a dolphin. But God didn't do that. He didn't create such a rift. It must have happened also not as long ago as scientists are suggesting. Because otherwise, those languages would have evolved into something that we just could not break through. If it had happened millions of years ago. But if it happens 4,500 years ago, we have a possibility of being able to understand each other. God is very creative, very powerful. This morning has been an awful lot more of a kind of a teaching on on language. We've not used a huge amount of scripture this morning to look at this subject.